Welcome to Annexation and the U.S.-Mexican War. As we go through these slides, if you need to pause, please go ahead and pause this video. Take whatever notes that you need to, and please resume whenever you're ready to move on. I'm going to say next slide, pause for a second, and then move to the next slide. And if you need a minute, you can go ahead and stop it then. All right? Here's my presentation of Annexation and the U.S.-Mexican War. Our key terms for this are annex or annexation, which means to add, especially territories. Joint resolution, a statement passed by both houses of the legislature and that has the force of law. Manifest destiny, a popular belief in the United States in the 1800s that the country must expand its boundaries from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Ratify, to approve formally, like two countries agreeing to something. Inciting, encourage to stir up violence or unlawful behavior, like building up before you get in trouble or getting in a fight. Cede or secession means to give up power or territory. Compromise, by settling an agreement that each side will change and give up some demands. Armistice, a temporary end to fighting. And reparations, payment for damages or suffering. Pause here if you need a review. Next slide. The Republic of Texas, 1836 to 1845. Texans first voted to join the United States in 1836. Sam Houston supported the first president of Texas. Sam Houston supported annexation. He was the first president of Texas. The United States did not annex Texas at that time because they did not want a war with Mexico or the spread of slavery. And Texas' second president, Mirabeau Lamar, opposed annexation because he wanted to keep his power as president. Next slide. U.S. President election of 1844. Democrat James K. Polk ran against Whig Henry Clay. Polk called for the annexation of Texas and Manifest Destiny, and Polk wins with 170 electoral votes to Clay's 105. Polk becomes known as the Manifest Destiny president because he oversaw the largest territorial expansion in U.S. history. Next slide. Annexation of Texas, 1844 to 1845. The Treaty of Annexation in 1844, the U.S. agreed to pay off Texas's $12 million in debt from the Revolution and running its own country. Congress rejected the Treaty of Annexation because it would upset the balance of power between slave states, which are your southern states, and your non-slave states, which are your northern states. Anson Jones, the last president of Texas, favored annexation like Houston did. The U.S. Congress passed a joint resolution annexing Texas in 1845. Next slide. Annexation of Texas, 1844 to 1845. Texas drafts state constitutions, and Texans approved the new state constitution by 4,174 votes to 312. Native Americans and African Americans were not allowed to vote on the Constitution because they are not recognized as citizens. And Texas became the 28th state on December 29, 1845. Now, pros and cons of annexation. This is the next slide. The pros, or the reasons for, are Manifest Destiny, the cotton trade, expansion of slavery in the South. The South would view that as a good thing. American population would get to join Texas. Texas has a large shipping port where ships can come and go from. And we have a huge amount of land to be settled. Reasons against, or con. The expansion of slavery. The North, where there was no slavery, did not want slavery to expand with Texas. They were afraid of war with Mexico. Mexico still claimed Texas. And the U.S. would lose $12 million by paying Texas's debt. We also had a large hostile Native American population. Why? Next slide. The first leaders of the state of Texas. James Pinckney Henderson was the first governor of Texas. Sam Houston and Thomas Rusk were the first U.S. senators from Texas. Next slide. Causes of the U.S.-Mexican War. Annexation of Texas in the United States, but Texas was annexed into the United States in 1845. So Texas joins the U.S. in 1845. Mexico disputes the southern border of Texas. For one, Mexico claimed the Nueces River as the southern border, and Texas and U.S. claimed the Rio Grande. So this border dispute would cause problems. The U.S. also demanded Mexico pay reparations to Americans for the damages before and after the Texas Revolution. Next slide. U.S. pre-war offer. President Polk offers Mexico $30 million for the disputed territory of Texas, California, Arizona, and New Mexico. Mexico declines the offer, so Polk sends troops to Texas in response. Next slide. This is a map of the U.S.-Mexican War and troop movements. Next slide. Fighting breaks out. President Polk orders General Zachary Taylor and his soldiers to Texas. They set up a camp across the Nueces River near the Rio Grande, and Mexico sends General Mariano Arista and his soldiers to the Rio Grande. Of course, they eventually start fighting. Mexico abused the U.S. soldiers being past the Nueces River as an invasion tactic and attacks. 16 U.S. soldiers are killed, and Polk asked Congress for a declaration of war after the attack in response. Next slide. Fighting breaks out. Polk claims that Mexico had shed American blood on American soil. Congress approves the declaration of war, and thousands of Texans volunteer to fight. Next slide. Zachary Taylor was commander of the U.S. Army in Texas, future President of the United States. He was a Whig, that was his political party, in 1848. His nickname was Old Rough and Ready from his days in previous wars, and he did not get along with President James K. Polk. Next slide. First Battle of Palo Alto on May 8, 1846. This was the first major battle of the Mexican-American War, fought outside of modern Brownsville, Texas. Zachary Taylor and the U.S. won the battle using his superior artillery, which means cannons. The Mexican-American War was pushed back to the Rio Grande, and the victory was a huge morale boost in the United States, helping make Zachary Taylor a political star and securing his position as future president. Next slide. 2. The Battle of Resaca de la Palma, May 8, 1846. Resaca means dry riverbed in Spanish. After their defeat at Palo Alto, the Mexican army had retreated across the Rio Grande to the Resaca de la Palma. It was fought near Brownsville, Texas, and Taylor crushed Arista's Mexican army, and they would have to promise that they would never set foot in Texas again. Next slide. Mexicans needed a new leader. Santa Anna steps in, becomes dictator. Next slide. Santa Anna again. The defeats at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma led to political unrest in Mexico. Antonio Lopez de Santana took advantage of the unrest to make a comeback and return to Mexico from Cuba, where he'd been sent after losing the Texas Revolution. He promised the U.S. that if allowed to pass through their blockade of Mexico, he would 1. Negotiate a peaceful conclusion to the war, 2. Sell the New Mexico and California territories to the U.S., and upon returning to Mexico, he broke his promise and offered his military skills to the Mexican government. After he'd been appointed general, he took control and became president again. Next slide. Winfield Scott, Old Fuss and Feathers. Polk put Scott in charge of the Mexican invasion when he got in a political fight with Zachary Taylor. The Whig nominee for president in 1852, he loses to Franklin Pierce, and he serves with the Union during the Civil War. Next slide. Siege of Veracruz, March 9th and March 29th to 1847. Battle dates were March 9th to March 29th in 1847. On March 9th, 1847, Scott lands about 13,000 troops by the sea at Veracruz on the eastern coast of Mexico. 25,000 American soldiers against 4,000 Mexican soldiers. The siege lasts about 18 days and was surrendered by Mexico on March 29, 1847. After capturing Veracruz, Scott marched his troops from the coast all the way to Mexico City. Next slide. Battle of Chapultepec. Scott eventually drove his way near Mexico City, and the Americans won the Battle of Chapultepec in the September of 1847. Chapultepec was a castle that protected Mexico City from the west, where Scott was coming. In Los Niños Heroes. During the battle, 6 Mexican artillery cadets refused to fall back when ordered to retreat, fought to the death against the superior U.S. forces. One by one they fell. When one was left, Juan Escutia, and the U.S. forces were about to kill him, he grabbed the Mexican flag, wrapped it around himself, and jumped off the castle wall. Next slide. Capturing Mexico City and the end of the U.S.-Mexican War. General Scott and his army advanced westward to Mexico City while General Taylor and his troops were advancing deeper into Mexico. General Scott's army suffered setbacks on the way to the capital, but, in September of 1847, he managed to capture Mexico City and convinced the Mexican government to negotiate into the war. Next slide. The Mexican Secession. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in 1848, officially ending the war. In this treaty, Mexico was forced to cede or give up the modern Southwest that makes up the present-day states of California, Nevada, Utah, parts of Wyoming, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. And in return for this land, the U.S. also had to pay $15 million in cash. That was $15 million in cash for the Mexican secession, and $3.25 million to the people in the new territory that claimed Mexico owed them money. Rio Grande established as the southern border of Texas. Next slide. This is a map of Manifest Destiny showing the territories and when they came in. Pause to use. Next slide. After the war. Picture after the war. Next slide. Completing the continental United States, the Gadsden Purchase. The last bit of territory added up to the continental U.S. was a strip of land across what is now southern New Mexico and Arizona. In 1853, Mexico sold the Gadsden Purchase to the U.S. for $10 million, and therefore this new Gadsden Purchase formed the southern border and gave the United States its current shape. The U.S. now stretched from sea to shining sea. Oregon Territory. James K. Polk had already secured the northern U.S. territory by splitting the Oregon Territory with Great Britain in 1846, and they agreed to split the land at the area split of the current Canadian border. Next slide. Issue of slavery. Texas had originally been denied as a state in 1836 because the northern states did not want Texas to join the U.S. as a slave state. However, as long as the number of slave states was even with the number of free states, both sides were happy. If both sides were able to control the land in New Mexico, that would have made it open to slavery, and the northern states would have refused. Next slide. Compromise of 1850. California now joined as a free state. New Mexico and Utah became territories and voted whether or not they wanted slavery. The slave trade, but not slavery itself, was ended in Washington. The Fugitive Slave Act was passed. Runaway slaves can now legally return to their owner. And Texas was paid $10 million to give up some of its territory. Next slide. What about Texas? Texas was part of the 1850 Compromise, joining America. America paid $10 million, and this created present-day Texas. Many Texans were angry about the agreement, but they realized they needed the money to pay off their debts and the land. And here's the map of America today.